Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to see so many of you here this evening. Welcome to what is the first of a series of development debates. My name is Sam Mardell. I'm the manager at the London International Development Centre, and we're co-organising these events with The Guardian. Just to give you a bit of background for those who aren't aware, I think most of you who are here today are actually members of the LIDC, but we were formed of a group of University of London colleges to bring together academics and students interested in research based around low and middle income countries. And if any of you here this evening are students at any of our member colleges, which are Birkbeck, SOAS, the London School, the RVC or UCL's Institute of Education, you can join for free by going to our website and just clicking on the join button there. So this is, as I said, the first debate in a series of 5 this academic year. They're going to be scattered throughout the year, and it's going to be a very interesting programme of debates. We're hoping to stimulate a lot of interesting ideas and discussions. The next debate, if you want to jot this down in your calendars now, it will be on the 1st of December. And interestingly, our final debate does not yet have a topic, and we want our student members to determine and help organise that final debate. So if you have a good idea and a burning desire to have a particular topic discussed, please do get in touch with us and we will help make that happen. So I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to hand over to our moderator for this evening, who is Bibi Van Der Zee. She is the editor of The Guardian's Global Development Professionals Network, and she will be introducing both our panel and the topic for this evening. Bibi, thanks.
Well, I was going to start by introducing myself, but that's already happened. So we'll talk a little bit about this enormous and fascinating subject that we've decided slightly madly to tackle for the first debate. Are we getting development aid right? So we're in a challenging environment globally. You know, I sort of was picking a sort of short list of some of the challenges that we face at the moment, and shifting geopolitics, climate change, conflict, soaring unemployment rates in certain parts of the world. That's just sort of a few. You know, we've then, on top of this, we've set ourselves the colossal challenge of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Again, a massive, ridiculous challenge, a wonderful, sort of optimistic vision for the world, if we can do it, but one that will cost an estimated 4.5 billion a year. Is it trillion or billion? It's billion, isn't it? It can't be trillion. But that's bad enough, really, isn't it? And to do this huge, massive project, we have our sort of glued together, battered, ad hoc system of development and humanitarian aid, official development assistance, and all the others. And now, is this the right way to do this? So have we got the equipment to sort of set out on the journey, on the challenge that we've set ourselves? So that's what we're going to be discussing tonight. We've got a really, really astonishingly great panel. We've got Fatimah Kelleher, who works and advocates internationally, mainly in Africa, on women's rights and social development. We have Professor Stephen Chan, who is an academic, works at SOAS, so he's obviously come a long way tonight, who's also an author, and I discovered today as a poet and a martial arts expert. So he may just win the debate with some knockout. We've got Cara Hansen, who is a professor of health economics, health system economics, and a member of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Centre for Evaluation. And her special interest is the economics of health. And we've got Stephen Doughty, who's the Labour MP for Cardiff South and Penarth, who seems to single-handedly be taking on the government over their relationship with Saudi Arabia at the moment and Saudi Arabia's actions in Yemen. So it should be quite lively, I hope. They're all going to speak for a minute or two on their position on this subject, and then some of you have already sent us questions, so we're going to turn over to you with your questions. You know, if you didn't send one in, it's fine. There'll still be time to ask one as we go along, and see if we make any progress. Fatimah, would you like to start? I'm so sorry.
Okay, so a minute or two
to
try and attempt this rather huge question. Thinking about this, I thought, okay, rather than trying to condense the essay that I would have given ordinarily into 2 minutes, which is impossible, I'm just going to focus in on one area for me, and that's really looking at the human issue and sort of the human experience that I've encountered throughout my work over the last 16 years. And I think I'm going to actually start by just going straight to the chase and answering the question that this panel does pose. Are we getting it right? And to be frank, the answer is no. Now, having said that, that's not to say that aid has not made a difference in many people's lives. It has. So, you know, if you go into any developmental space, you will come across thousands of people who have had a full education as a result of development programming, who have had access to healthcare as a result of development programming, better livelihoods as a result of development programming. But for all of those instances, in my experience, I've come across far more of where the challenges seem to be preventing that more sustainable and macro end result where you actually can see the trajectory towards development, towards a space where everybody is benefiting from the system. And so in my experience, you know, it could be anything from going into a focus group discussion with women as you are looking at a program that's already in flow and finding out that these women have had several cycles of aid programming come into their lives over the last 10 to 15 years. Some of it worked, but it worked for a short period of time, and then it wound down and it left. Sometimes it left them with debts. In other cases, it didn't leave them with anything negative, but it didn't leave them with anything beyond. So it was not sustained. A lot of our programming has become even shorter than it was before. And the willingness to sort of commit to the long term has definitely gone down, and this is a major challenge. And then the next part of that really also is that there is this sense that development is being done at people and not with people. And this is of great concern, particularly coming from the rights-based approach that I adopt within my work. I think it's not anything new to say that when it comes to the consultations around the overarching frameworks that determine, you know, the development mandates we're going forward with, such as the SDGs, Southern voices are not heard as they should be. And that's not just at the governmental level, but particularly at the grassroots level. And so you will have a scenario where there are many people who want the aid to come in and actually don't want to tell you that they have a problem with it. And so, you know, in confidences they might, but they won't actually be honest about how problematic, or how much it actually goes in conflict with where they see their own development trajectory coming in. But we'll just roll ahead anyway. And that's a huge issue because you're not actually getting that consensus and that agreement from the people who we're working with. So that needs to change. We need to make far more efforts in that area. And then finally, I think the fragmentation that you mentioned of, you know, the way the system works with so many different actors, that needs to be addressed seriously, because when you see how that works on the ground with the various competitions in play in terms of what's happening, you can see just an ongoing scenario of individual programs delivering primarily for themselves, but not delivering into this wider goal as a unit. This has been my biggest issue with the system. And so within that, just to reiterate, there are successes. It's not a complete washout, and people's lives have been changed. But we have so much further to go, and I think to pretend otherwise would be deeply naive, but also deeply irresponsible.
Thank you, Fatimah. Stephen, would you like to follow on?
Well, I'm broadly in agreement with what Fatimah said. Almost exactly a year ago today, I was sharing a panel with Dambisa Moyo, who wrote a book on dead aid, basically calling into question the whole viability of aid. And we were on opposite sides of the debate, just she and I. But in fact, I think that I found much in agreement with her, in the sense that so much of the aid that we purport to give is not actually assisting anybody but ourselves. In other words, it's as much as it were a device for our own exporting of expertise and equipment as it is to help anybody on the ground. But the point that I particularly went away to think about, to ponder about, and I first got involved with this many, many decades ago in Africa itself, was the fact of what I think Fatimah was alluding to, and that is a very, very strict hierarchy in terms of aid. And I found this with a number of governments. I've worked with a number of governments around the world, including the Chinese government, which of course is ramping up its aid program to many parts of the world, including Africa. And everybody has the same hierarchical approach. We give, you receive, therefore you receive on our terms. It has to be our terms because we have to satisfy our auditors who are scrutinizing how we spend taxpayers' money. And this is very much the theme of our current Secretary of State for Development's value for money speech just over the last few days. How do we measure the value of what we give? Well, we're going to have to measure it in accounting terms, in unit terms, units of account, things that will satisfy us that we did something good for them, whether or not they found it good or not. So I think that we have a real problem here. The minute we talk about ourselves being the deliverers of benefit and the others are beneficiaries and recipients, just in that kind of discourse we establish a hierarchy that we never break out of in operational terms, in practice terms. And I think this is something which has come from governments around the world of both right and left persuasions. I think this is as much, if I might sort of look at Stephen here, a fault of Labour administrations as it is of Tory administrations. And also I have problems, I think, with the antidote to all of this, the rather nicely phrased, let's do trade rather than aid. We don't actually want that because the minute we actually do meaningful trade, let's say Africa, as an example, produces industrial goods, that is, they produce manufactures that are then exported to us, and these manufactures are manufactured more cheaply than in our industrial strongholds, and our working class loses its jobs. The most progressive parts of society would instantly become the most conservative in terms of brotherhood and sisterhood and solidarity with those who are meant to be at the bottom of the heap and who should rightly, in those terms, stay at the bottom of the heap so they don't challenge us. All of our aid, including our Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennial Development Goals before them, is to raise people up to a certain level where they can't overtake us. That's hierarchy, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Stephen. Cara, would you like to follow on from that?
So I'm going to change tack a little bit, because I suppose where I come to this topic from is from this question of evaluation. And as a member of the School Center for Evaluation, I think it's really important to think about how evaluation can serve as a tool of accountability of donors, accountability of recipient governments, sorry to use that language, and of course accountability to a broader set of stakeholders. And now when we think about evaluation, we've got a whole sort of range of questions, from the really big questions like, does aid work? Or probably more appropriately framed as, under what circumstances does aid work and how can it be made to work better? It's one sort of set of evaluation questions. There's another set of questions about aid modalities. So what are the relative merits of budget support or sector-wide approaches or traditional projects and programs, and how does that vary with context? Because obviously contexts are very different and set up very different types of challenges in terms of how aid funds are used and used effectively. There's another set of questions around the effects and effectiveness of a variety of programs and projects and interventions. And that, I think, you're sitting in a public health school, I think that's a place where the public health field is really led in terms of thinking about how do you evaluate these programs and projects to understand where they're working, how they're working, who's benefiting. And that can be from large, multi-country, complex projects like the malaria drugs financing facility that the Global Fund ran for a number of years, right through to cash transfer programs or very specific ways of delivering maternal and child health services. And I think that's an area where thinking about evaluation, the fitness of our methods of evaluation to answer really different types of questions is terribly important. And the last use of evaluation, which is also to think about how do we as researchers and as evaluators bring information into play to help monitor programs as they go, so to allow course corrections and improvements in the way that aid is delivered, and how, I suppose, to avoid getting into a position of too great independence and separation from a program, and think about how can we use evaluation and its toolkit to really improve the way that programs are being implemented. So I think that's a range of issues that are really important for thinking about this issue of accountability and how we do understand the aid to be having an impact or not. Thanks.
And finally, Stephen.
Well, I always feel a little bit of a fraud on panels with distinguished academic and practitioner colleagues, because I'm just a mere politician. But I will do my best to answer the essay question. So, should we be doing aid still? Absolutely yes. But are we getting all of it right? No. And in that I would agree with many of the comments that have been made before. And is aid alone itself sufficient? Well, clearly not. And I think actually one of the big moves forward with the SDGs and the agreement of those is a real recognition that unless we are getting things right, whether it's in terms of the role of corporates in the world, whether it's in terms of sustainability, whether it's in terms of wider economic and social frameworks and rights frameworks, then we are not going to achieve the goals we want to, which are ending poverty and ensuring everybody has access to clean water or health or whatever it might be. And aid is never going to be 100% perfect. We can always pick up examples. I've seen a lot of bad aid done. I've seen bad aid done by the department I used to work in, by the Department for International Development, and by the NGOs that I used to work for. But on the whole, we were getting a lot of things right. And I think there is always a danger of sort of throwing the baby out with the proverbial bathwater if we engage in somewhat glib statements that we've seen recently from the Secretary of State for International Development here in the UK, or indeed colleagues like Dan Beeson, where I know in terms of what she says in detail, it's a lot different, but just saying aid is dead is not particularly helpful. We should always be critical, we should always be evaluating, we should always be going back to the principles of what we're trying to achieve, and we should always be asking, is what we're doing transformative? And is it truly development cooperation? That's something that I think has been lost somewhat in the debate, and I fear we're retrenching back actually in this country into a more utilitarian form of aid rather than true cooperation, where we are looking at the rights of individuals, where we are engaging with recipients, we are listening to what they're saying, we are seeing if things are truly catalytic and transformative. But I fear that at the moment, certainly in this country, and a number of comments I'll make tonight will reflect where we are here today, is that I think we see the whole agenda of development, of engagement with those who have less than we do, of where there is injustice in the world, is in danger of retrenchment, and not just in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, but in terms of some of the ideology that we're seeing, some of the statements that we're making. And I would like to sort of really end on this, a focus of shifting back to much more utilitarian purposes, seeing aid spent, for example, by departments that not only don't have that same agenda of poverty reduction, but also have perhaps other agendas that they're trying to engage with. 26% of Britain's official development assistance, of our aid, will be spent by departments other than the Department for International Development by 2019. And that's a really worrying alarm call to me, because not only does that suggest it might be used for other purposes, but actually it's not going to undergo the same rigour and scrutiny and expertise that we do actually see in the UK Department for International Development, and that allows committees that I sit on in Parliament, and I sit on both the International Development Committee and the committee that looks at the Independent Commission on Aid Impact Studies, enables us to hold them to account. And so I do see some really worrying trends. Do we want to go back to the days of the Pergo Dam, those sorts of scandals that we saw in the past? For those of you who don't know the Pergo Dam, obviously look it up. But it's about whether we are truly engaging in development cooperation, or whether we're going back to a more utilitarian form, which I think ultimately will fail.
Now, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege of asking the first question, because I want to. And I want to follow on from that subject that Stephen was discussing. I mean, obviously, in a post-Brexit world, all of our assumptions are kind of being thrown up in the air anyway. We don't really know what's going to come down. And Priti Patel has been in position for about 5 minutes. And so we're still, as with Theresa May, trying to play a guessing game between what she says and what she's going to do. And, there seems to be no way of actually judging what is true and what is actually going to happen. And I wondered what you think, how, clearly she's indicated a new direction for British aid, something that, we need to take extremely seriously. I mean, how much is she going to follow through on this? How much pushback is there going to be? And what can we, what should we be doing about it? I'd like to start with you, but I'd love the other panelists to jump in as well.
Well, I'd respond on 2 points. I think I've been deeply worried about a lot of the rhetoric that's been being used, and I think the jury is still out about what that means in practice. But for example, she was briefing many of the papers the last couple of weeks that all of our aid money was stolen and squandered, were the words. Now, I'm sure I can find parts of our aid budget that have been stolen or squandered, right? That is the reality when you are working particularly in extremely complex, fragile environments, difficult circumstances. But when I questioned her and said, well, how much, Secretary of State? What project? What percentage? No answers. And I think we're in a real danger if we get into those sort of rhetorical games. The second issue is on trade, and it's already been mentioned. This idea that we haven't been doing development assistance to facilitate trade and economic development and growth and trading partnerships is a nonsense. In fact, trade has always been at the centre of the work, certainly of British aid in the past. And whether that's building up capacity, whether that's delivering infrastructure, or whether that's doing essential things like building up tax systems to ensure that taxation can be taken directly to help build up governments so that they can start providing services to their own citizens and build that social contract. It's always been at the heart of what we've done. So creating this idea that some sort of new direction, I think, is a bit of a myth.
Thank you. Do any of you want to jump in on that? Yes, Stephen. Other Stephen. Correct.
I think in a post-Brexit world, we're going to be looking at a diminution of British aid. So whether it's good or bad is going to go down. Because don't forget, apart from our bilateral aid, which we give directly to recipient countries, we're also a major contribution to the European Development Fund. Through that multilateral channel, if you put both our multilateral and bilateral aid together, we become a very significant player in the world of international aid. That's going to diminish now automatically as a result of Brexit. So if aid is good, we're going to be doing less of it. If aid is bad, well, maybe it might be a good thing that we do less of it. Or we might start, and this is my real worry, start doing more kinds of aid which I think are questionable. I don't want to put a blanket statement on this because the world is facing very grave emergencies, but I do see a worrying trend in a number of Western countries to increase the level of military aid. And whether or not that's the best way to address some of the very vexatious problems for which there are no easy answers, of course, in the world today, I'm not really sure that this is a trend that should go by unobserved or uncriticized.
If you just, you want to, yes.
I think in terms of the language that's been coming out recently, what worries me the most is that we are having a more, and we were discussing this very briefly before we sat down, a more explicitly sort of conveyed sentiment towards aid really delivering on British interests, as opposed to looking actually at what the interests of southern countries need, of developing countries need. And this worries me. I'm a Brit, but I'm also a Nigerian. And I think there's always been that tension there, actually. But I think now it seems to be a lot more overt. And so I think one of the things I would want to see going forward is a real questioning of that. If we are going to be doing aid, you know, are we taking the gloves off around this issue of, you know, sort of the moral impetus, or are we being very explicit about the fact that we're doing it for our own British interests? You know, one of the things about China that people have always said is that there's an honesty in that relationship. It's quite transactional to a certain extent, so you know where you stand. Having said that, it does have its own conditionalities within it. Is this where we would essentially be going if we're being a lot more explicit about our needs for development assistance over the needs of those coming from the developing countries? And to what extent does that fly in the face of the Paris Declaration and the fact that developing countries are supposed to be actually strategizing and prioritizing the money that comes into their country?
Now, Gala and Johannes have got microphones somewhere, and we're going to. The first question is: where's Kathy Presland? Ah, great. So, yes, Kathy's got a question.
Hi, thanks very much. So I have a question. I'm a former economist. I'm going to focus this on economic development, reducing income inequality, although I appreciate, obviously, development is much wider. But I think given that there's some good, there's some bad in development aid, we're in an era where things are rapidly changing. There are lots of different models from other countries, from other individuals. We've mentioned China. I see a lot of philanthropic interventions as well. So I just would really like to ask your thoughts on some of those new models, both perhaps from a practical perspective, what you've seen that works and doesn't work, but also from a kind of innovation, theoretical ideas perspective. You know, what could we do differently if the objective was to reduce income inequality and to promote economic growth in the poorest countries?
It's a great question. Who wants to jump in first? Stephen. Oh, no. Professor has leapt to the microphone.
No, please. I'll just briefly touch on two of this. I mean, there's a big question. I mean, clearly, you know, there isn't one size fits all, and no one model of aid is the right one, and they all have their pros and cons. You know, two that I've had particular dealings with in recent years. I worked on a major Gates Foundation grant. Obviously, you know, Bill Gates Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic donors in the world, and I think there are clearly parts of their work that you can criticise, but I think what I did like was the focus on that catalytic investment in certain areas, particularly in some of the health projects that they funded, but also that they were interested in funding civil society, funding accountability in country as well. I worked on a partnership between Oxfam and themselves where we were looking at health campaigning in 14 different countries that was Southern led, and that was funded by Bill Gates' foundation, and I think there are some really interesting things you can do there. Remittances, though, you know, often missed in the whole development finance space, absolutely massive. I have a huge population of Somalilanders in my constituency, very closely linked back to Somaliland in the Horn of Africa, who you know, regularly providing their own development financing, huge value there. And actually, there was a huge challenge recently when they were having some of the banking facilities cut off, and the risk of losing that actually was far greater than you know, any sort of minor change in DFID funding. So I think we've always got to be looking at all those different models and how we're supporting and encouraging them.
I want to come back to the issue of remittances afterwards, actually, if that's okay, but I'll start off with sort of my initial response. So I do a fair bit of work on women's economic empowerment and justice issues. And there, you know, income inequality within a lot of the programming, particularly economic development programming, where gender targets are quite high, is sort of framed within the end goal of income increase. And so what you'd have is a program that looks at increasing incomes by X%, normally 15%. That seems to be the magic percentage across a lot of these programs by, you know, the end of 5 years. And if you've managed to achieve that, then, you know, you've reduced income inequality. What is often missing, actually, around from the development debate around income inequality is a discourse on class. and systemic inequalities within societies, gender just being one of them. So often you won't have conversations around power relationships, and often you will not be given the financing to indulge, I use the word indulge actually, to do the necessary work of researching those power relationships and those informal economies in order to understand what really genuinely works, because it's often not seen as being very value for money to put your programming funds into that area. So that is the first thing that needs to change within that area. Just coming very quickly in terms of remittances, I've been for a long time sort of, quite a supporter of the discourse around remittances, but I do urge some caution in that area, because in my experience, remittances are often used as social protection, at the grassroots. And what this does, then it takes away the burden from the state for providing essential services. So I think that's something we always have to be cognizant of. And that's not to say that it's not an area that we need to look at developing, but I think sometimes the discourse misses that out.
Thank you. Cara.
So Fatimah's comments made me think a little bit about these issues of where should aid go, because we do know there's a large number of countries who clearly don't have the interests of the poorest and the most marginalized at the center of their public policy discourses and actions. And I think that's an area where we should be looking again at how do we actually use aid to make sure that those populations can actually can be reached with essential services. But I think that question about how do you operate in a setting where the government is happy to leave large segments of the population completely outside of the reach of public services is a really critical issue. And I think it should be shaping part of our advocacy and our discourses at the political level with governments, but also it makes us have to think about some of these other new modalities and how do we deal with NGOs, local NGOs, international NGOs, what sorts of groups are able to reach those people who are the most marginalized and are not the focus of their government's activities.
Just a couple of quick issues on the remittances issue. I mean, it differs very greatly from country to country, for instance, but the remittances sent home by the Zimbabwean diaspora, many of whom were here, well, the majority of whom were here illegally, during the years of hyperinflation, is what basically kept a huge segment of the population sustainable, able to live, able to partake in ordinary economic exchange, like buying food, for instance. So remittance, I think, does play a huge role, but being able to measure it, being able to direct it, being able to ensure it's not put to ill use, of course, these are things that you can't regulate. On the issue of economic equality or greater economic equality, one of the things that worries me, and I did some work with the Malaysian government on this back in the 1970s, who were prepared to loss lead, and they used that term quite dramatically in a way that most governments would not, because they were using public monies, of course, in putting money behind young entrepreneurs in the informal sector. Now, there's no way you can actually measure this, the utility of that money, whether it's going to work, whether it's just going to disappear into the sector that's immediately adjacent to the informal sector, which is the criminal sector. But if you want to raise people out of their present condition so that they have greater income, very often their present condition is not only marginal but illegal. They're operating those businesses illegally. Now, where are the models? There aren't any models that I know that are robustly able to deal with this very, very pertinent question. So every time we talk about reducing income gaps, we're talking really in terms of being able to increase greater formal employment, being able to reduce inequalities within the formal sector using formal means of measure. Whereas I think the starting point has to be so far down in the grassroots that you are prepared to loss lead working in the informal sector.
That's a really great point. Jeremy O'Brien, where are you? Ah, right up the back there. I think Johanna's just coming with a microphone. Remittances are actually larger than ODA, aren't they, as I understand it? I mean, it's a significant...
Hi, everyone. So my question kind of related to your opening point, Fatimah. So there's so many aid organizations and institutions involved in development. And so my question is, how can we ensure that everyone is working together in a streamlined process instead of competing towards this one common goal of development, and how does that process kind of formulate?
A challenging one.
Thanks. So this is the key question, really, in many ways. To a certain extent, it comes back to the issue of ownership at the national level. You know, if that was effective, if that was working well, to a certain extent, it would take care of itself. But in terms of what's happening on the ground between the various developing partners, there are ways. You know, so there's a lot of competition. And this competition exists sometimes between bilaterals and various agencies, and sometimes it actually exists within. So different programs being funded by one bilateral agency will actually be competing against each other. It's never explicitly said, but you know, you will see it there in various forms. And often what tends to happen is there will be some move towards some kind of cooperation and it will often be driven by an individual or a group of individuals. I think the agencies themselves can make the difference. So if you're looking at the internal conflict between programs within one agency, to be honest with you, there needs to be a much clearer line around enhanced cooperation, and I'm not seeing that at the moment. And so if you have individuals who are willing to set up some sort of, you know, group that crosses between the various programs, that's great, but then they'll move on in 2 years or 3 years to their next role. In terms of wider harmonization amongst all development partners, to a certain extent that is reliant on the national ownership issue, and that's why it's a lot trickier, because it will vary from country to country in terms of their capacity and the political will there. There was an initiative quite a few years back in the education sector called the Fast Track Initiative, which was aimed at trying to do this. And for a little while, it seemed to be working. But then since then, I haven't actually seen it move into anything more concrete. So actually trying to understand how perhaps that didn't work as well would give us some insights. But I'd say those two areas in terms of political will and clearer lines coming from the agencies themselves would be key.
Stephen.
There clearly is a problem with, you know, lack of cooperation in many areas and chasing after the same objectives or bidding for the same things and so on. But I just give two positive examples. I think the Global Fund for HIV, TB and malaria, I think has been a really good example of governments pooling funds together and working on some very, very defined targets and having some huge impacts. And I think that has been reflected in its recent replenishment, where it's received a huge new boost in funding. I think that's a great example. I think there have been some really good examples actually in the humanitarian space in particular of coordination. People might be familiar with the Disasters Emergency Committee here in the UK. When there's a disaster, you'll see the ads on the TV saying, you know, give money and so on. But actually behind the scenes, that is then apportioned, oversimplifying here, but it's apportioned amongst agencies based on their actual ability to deliver in that particular crisis or disaster, and their actual weight and their influence, their ability to do something useful is not just given out to everybody equally, and some then perform less well with it. And I think there, particularly in the humanitarian space as well at an international level, there has been a lot more focus around clusters, around, for example, shelter or water and sanitation, whatever it might be, which has enabled both closer cooperation between different actors, whether that's NGOs or bilateral donors or others, UN agencies and so on, and of course, you know, host countries that they're in. So there are a lot of positive examples, but there is a lot of bad practice as well.
Cara.
So a really graphic example of bad practice. There's got a famous example from the health sector of the number of bilateral missions that the Ministry of Health in Tanzania gets every year, which is in excess of 300. So it's more than one mission a day of agencies coming to negotiate and discuss their program. And so I think, you know, as with the Fast Track Initiative in education, there's also been efforts around sort of one plan type ideas of having a single sector plan for health that people are prepared to contribute budgets to for budget support. And I suppose one of my worries in the current environment is that this increased emphasis on
labeling and claiming contribution is going to really undermine the ability of British aid to go into those one plan type structures, which give such great opportunities for coordination and cooperation.
And I mean, I think also it's worth, I mean, on the subject of trying to streamline and work together, I mean, the UN at the head of all of this is obviously one of the most graphic examples of, I mean, sometimes they are obviously fantastic, but they're also horrific at turf wars, and the departments tend to battle with each other. And the World Humanitarian Summit this year earlier was just has been followed, amazingly, the UN convened all the humanitarian sectors for this massive once-in-a-lifetime summit, brought everyone together, and I think one or two initiatives managed to sort of limp out of the huge circus, and none of those have been actually put into motion yet. And my understanding is that there's a battle between various UN departments about which one's going to run them. So it's quite hard, I think, for the people on the ground to cope when the UN itself is pretty dysfunctional. But
just one brief thing I would say though. I have to say my tendency has been to believe that doing things on a bigger scale and on a multilateral level generally, in my experience, has been more positive. I think there is a real danger at the moment. We talked about Brexit and us pulling out of European development funds and things like that, that we go back to some quite short-term, quite a mini-focused bilateral programming that actually doesn't deliver at the scale that you can do when you're engaging and cooperating with other donors and indeed the countries themselves.
Next question, Lawrence Cockcroft. Hello, just over here. Right behind you, Janice.
Thank you very much. I'm associated with Transparency International, which explains my question. Has the world of aid failed to come to grips with the phenomenon of corruption? In asking that question, I just want to add a couple of points in explanation. I'm really not inviting the panel to discuss whether or not aid projects are subverted by corruption themselves. I'm raising the issue of aid in the context of societies where there are very high levels of corruption, which impacts on policy making at a macro level, so that vested interests in one form or another can undermine the specifics of a particular project. And finally, I want to link that to the question of illicit financial flows, which have been highlighted and recognized very widely over the last 5 years as a phenomenon which is draining countries of resources. But this is not only a question of maybe Western companies operating in those countries, it's also a question of capital outflow as a result of huge levels of corruption.
Stephen?
That's a huge one. If I may, Lawrence, let me take the last one. I think, transparency is obviously is key, and I think there have been a number of initiatives that I think we'll hopefully start to see some fruit. Talking about illicit flows, I've long term been a supporter of country by country reporting on taxation, on sharing of tax information across borders. We have seen some progress on that in terms of the UK's role in pushing on some of those issues, not as far as we would like. Myself and Carolyn Flint and others sponsored amendments in the finance bill recently on that issue. And clearly, if we can see where some of this money is going and where tax is or isn't being paid, that will be part of it. Might not solve the problem, but at least we might get some better idea about what's going on. And then the other issue actually, and going back to sort of the wider aid debate, is initiatives like Publish What You Fund, and again, the more information that is out there that either citizens can use to hold their own governments to account, whether that's in a donor country or a recipient country, the better. And that ultimately is the only way we're going to deal with some of these issues. But maybe the other panelists want to comment on the wider points. Have we got to grips with corruption in programmes?
I think that we haven't got to grips with international corruption, and this is because there are several forms of corruption, of course, which differ markedly from country to country, both in terms of scale, in terms of the sectors of elite persons involved with this, in terms of their association with criminal elements, and also in terms of how readily they can launder money that they steal, usually by using good offices in countries like ours. So corruption, for instance, cannot, in my opinion, be described simply as a developing country problem. If I'm going to launder the funds, and I will find it in my interest to launder the funds, I'm going to use the very best accountants and lawyers that I can find in the City of London. not only that, I'm going to do that, not only if I'm a corrupt oligarchic political figure in northern Nigeria, perhaps, but if I'm a Somali pirate. If I'm a Somali pirate, I'm going to have some capital fund flows which are going to benefit my community. The money is going to come back home. It's not just always going to go to a Swiss bank account. So the whole idea of capital flow and illicit flows, I think, is a very, very complex one, which is not unidirectional. You've got a whole international circus now of flows that go everywhere. And sometimes they come back home via very, very circuitous means, sometimes by being enriched while it does its travels around the international financial capitals of the world, and does finally bring some benefit back home, although also to the benefit of the person who stole those funds in the first place. But it's a phenomenon that we're not going to get rid of. I mean, funds get stolen from public purses in countries with underdeveloped private sectors. We are a very developed country here in the United Kingdom, and so we steal in a different way. If you think that there's no illicit capital flows in our top corporations or financial institutions, then I don't know where you're living. We just do it a lot better with a greater number of sources for where this money would come from. When you've only got one, you're going to go for it.
I'm going to take one more of the original questions and then open up to you guys, because we're running out of time, actually. Dominic Gillen, are you... here, over here. Because we've got just over 10 minutes left.
Hi, I'm a part-time student with Birkbeck, so I'm here. So my question kind of builds on your Gates example, Stephen, you mentioned before, but it's should they, and if so how, can donors better ensure local NGOs and community organisations in developing countries are properly funded and supported to play an effective part in the process of development?
Very good question. Who would like to share? Fatimah?
Yeah, I love that question. Recently, there was a committee meeting in Parliament that was looking at DFID's assistance in Nigeria. And there, one of my colleagues at Wise Development actually was a witness, and she was very clear that in the area, particularly looking at women's rights and women's development, far more needed to be done in terms of actually working with women's groups in the ground. Before the SDGs were formalised last year, the Association of Women in Development, AWID, put together some research that showed that during the MDG era, only the tiniest amount of funding had actually made it down to the grassroots level to work with women's organisations. And so it's quite interesting that we're talking about sustainable development, and yet what we have all acknowledged as sort of, the tool of sustainability, which is that civil society and grassroots accountability, continues to be subfunded. And there are various reasons for that. One of them actually is this issue of, a safe pair of hands and a fear of the money, going walkabout. But to be honest with you, I think a larger problem is what I mentioned earlier, which is the cycle of some of these programs are so short that even if you started off, in 5 years, you cannot build the capacity needed, before you move on. And if you then decide that your new priority is elsewhere, either regionally or, sort of thematically, then you've left them there. And there's this constant sort of, clash between the need to do that and the need to get the project done. And the need to deliver on the project. And this does feed into the earlier question of accountability as well, because what you'll often find is that a lot of programs, in their desire to get the project done, will not deal with some of the issues of ensuring that the people who you're working with are in a position to then demand accountability from the state organs that your program is embedded in, so that after you've moved on, it's not going to be a case of waiting for more aid. And so then that comes back to the aid dependency overarching issue. So all of this is actually linked together, but to try and convince donors to spend more money on community development, NGOs, particularly at the grassroots, and not just the big international NGOs, is immensely hard, but it needs to be advocated for, and we need a bigger voice around that.
Stephen?
I would agree with a lot of what Fatimah's just said, but and I think actually the tension, of course, is that, are you putting things into a safe pair of hands? Are you not? But I would argue you can actually lose effectiveness if you are not obviously giving through those types of organisations, and it's a constant struggle and a constant balance. I think the move that there has been in a number of the different programmes for funds that are available to be dispersed at a local level for relationships decisions to be made down at that level, I think is particularly helpful. I certainly know from examples that I had about partners that we worked with in Oxfam, there very much had been a shift within the organisation to ensuring that you were catalytically working with partners at a local level, so that whether it was the delivery of programme or whether it was the advocacy or the campaigning or the influence that organisation was having was sustainable, it was going to be long term and was going to carry on long after the particular grant or the particular funding that had been given at the time was there. My argument to the UK government would be, when they're looking at some of those partnerships they have with the larger NGOs, as important as those are, be really drilling down and seeing what are they doing with that money. Is it getting into the grassroots, and is it generating that accountability upwards in the system?
I mean, I just return actually to the World Humanitarian Summit. That one of the issues that did come up in the lead up to that was the fact that of all humanitarian funding, just 2% was going directly to the sort of grassroots humanitarian groups, and yet they were the ones who were taking the big hit. They were the ones who were actually in the field. They were the ones who were dying, literally. And that was one of the few things that seemed to come out of the summit agreement to lift that target, a target of 25% a year. But I mean, obviously, that's going to happen in about 25 years. So, who would like to ask a question? Please put your hands up. I'll take a couple of questions at a time, and then we'll try to get to them. Gentleman in the front here. You just wait for the microphone to come. Hang on.
Thank you. Just a quick question. What's often missing in this debate is the social context of what aid is. So the geopolitical reasons why aid exists and those reasons that sustain aid. So my question is, around here in the UK, that this is never discussed. So it's never discussed the role that the UK has geopolitically, the situations that have created why aid has arisen. Do you think that socially people would think differently of aid, for example, if you called it reparations instead of aid? So if you look at Pakistan, if you look at Syria, if you look at wherever you look, wherever the UK has a role, do you think people will take it differently if you call it reparations? So acknowledging the role that the UK has played in creating those situations and also sustaining those situations. Thank you.
Great question. Very popular question. Where are the hands? I'm sorry, I should have pointed. The gentleman back and the lady in front of him. If you two ask your questions, and then we'll take those all together or separate them, I don't know. We may have to wait a second, sorry. I've chosen the people furthest away.
Thank you for the appointment. So my question is relating to China and Japan. We were aware of that the Chinese government has announced the Belt and Road initiative in late 2013, where the international development aid will cover the East Africa. On the other hand, I heard that the Japanese government has raised a concept which is quality infrastructure, and the Japanese has also led the Asian Development Bank for several decades, and the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has just visited Kenya in early September. So my question is, from your practical perspective, what is the similarity and the fundamental difference between China and Japan when they implement the development aid in Africa, and do these countries play a complementary role or competitive role in a negative way? Thank you.
Really interesting. Thank you. And the lady here.
Hi, I'm a student at the London School of Economics. The question is related a lot to what Fatimah and Cara have said, and also Stephen and Stephen. It's about NGOs sort of chasing the money. So we have this constant conflict between wanting to reach certain objectives within specific timeframes that have been posed by donors, whether foundations or bilateral donors. And so at the end, and I say this from a personal experience, it's a lot of ticking boxes. Yes, we work in a consortium. Yes, it's sustainable. Yes, it's holistic. Oh, it includes women. And then we're actually doing a lot of that in 3-year times, when as NGOs we know that that's not realistic. How can we get aid to actually have an exit strategy? Like, how can we think about NGOs eventually being able to phase out and handing over those responsibilities to grassroots and local organizations? Because as a professor at the Columbia University said, you can tell how developed a country is by how many NGO workers, like what percentage of income that poses. So.
Okay, some quite existential questions here. Cara, do you want to start? You can't pretend your microphone doesn't work.
Yeah. So I'll take the last first, or the last. I think there is kind of a tension between sort of looking for an exit strategy and at the same time wanting to be able to avoid short-termism. So we actually want donors to be able to fund on a longer-term, more predictable trajectory, and at the same time to be able to build into an exit strategy. I think it's quite a challenge to marry those two things. There was an anecdote I heard once about people's aspirations in one East African country, and where young people were saying, yeah, what I really, really want to do is get a job in the NGO sector. And that's got to be an indicator of a sort of a distortion of priorities and a distortion of ambition and career trajectories. But I think there's a need to create this predictability, whether that's predictability for an NGO, so it's not sort of running around making stuff up to tick boxes, or whether it's predictability from a government point of view, being able to make commitments into the future that allow it to deliver in a sustainable way on its targets. But I think it's a real dilemma how to persuade the donor countries to take these longer term perspectives, and it's very very Paris in its orientation. Yet I don't know that we've seen the Paris Declaration, the ambitions and aspirations of the Paris Declaration really feed into longer term decision making.
Yes, if I can comment on the China-Japan question. I've been not only involved in working with the Chinese government on these issues, but way back in the early 1980s was a friend of Ambassador Sato, the Japanese ambassador to Zambia, who, when he finished his time in Zambia and went back to Tokyo, was instrumental basically in being the architect behind what the Japanese call their sunshine policy, which is the name they give to their international development policy. The two programs are very differently conceived. I mean, the Japanese program is not nearly as great in scale, obviously, as the Chinese program. There are some things which are very, very similar. The Japanese interest in building roads, and by and large, they do build better roads than the Chinese. But they're not as great, they're not as long, and they're not as ambitious in terms of the linkages they want to produce, in terms of linking up one part of the nation to another part. The Japanese also pioneered one or two things that the Chinese then stole as concepts, so that educational development, for instance, one of the things the Japanese did was to look at sectors in higher education which were lacking, particularly in African countries, such as a veterinary school at the National University. And so they would build an entire veterinary school and then staff it with volunteer retired Japanese professors of veterinary science who would take 2 years out from their retirement and actually feel useful and have an adventure in their autumn years and have a multiplier effect of talking about Africa when they went home. This kind of approach the Chinese have adopted in terms of building bigger roads, longer roads, and building communications infrastructure corridors, which is entirely new and original to the Chinese way of doing things. They've taken something basic and then transformed it into that which is qualitatively bigger, larger in the long run, much more effective than anything anyone else could possibly conceive of doing. Not just a road, but a railway, telephone lines, electronic links, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, even universities along the communications corridor, which can run for hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers. That kind of scale just leaves the rest of the aid world breathless. No one else can do it. Where it can work without us getting in the way, as it should have been allowed to work in Southern Democratic Republic of Congo, if the Chinese had had their way before we derailed it, it would have transformed the entire southern part of the most problematic country in Africa, and it would have ended the wars in Southeast Democratic Republic of Congo, because the government before could not get to those places to govern those places. So the Chinese saw the communications was key. When the Chinese work on infrastructure and communications and transport infrastructure in particular, there's no comparison. They're in a league of their own, a world of their own. The big question is, what do they want to get out of it at the end of the day? That's obviously a question that many of us should ask of many different aid programs. The Japanese aid program, as I said, is not nearly of that scale, and I think is far more philanthropic in terms of its conception. They just want to be seen to be doing something useful and seen to be doing something good. And this is most manifest, I think, in their youth volunteer program. I've talked about the old veterinary professors who get recycled for a couple of years out in the bush somewhere. But they're young volunteers, and the programs they're on and the skill sets they bring, I think, are much, much better than ours. It leaves our VSO for dead. They're just so good at taking stuff out into the deep wilds of the countries in which they operate. They become as much one with the people as a Japanese young person on a Honda motorbike can. And that's all they're given. A Honda motorbike, get out there and do it. Teach them baseball, teach them anything. Just get out there and live with the people. And it's a program-free, respond to your environment type of program, which, again, because of the way we want to control everything and account for everything, we simply don't try to replicate. So the two programs are very, very different. You're seeing a third newcomer from the Asian states on the blocks right now. I'm supervising a PhD right now on Korean aid, which is trying to take the best from both Chinese and Japanese aid. But they can't match the Chinese for scale, and they can't match the Japanese for quality at this moment in time. And they'll probably wind up trying to sell many Samsung telephones. Hopefully not Samsung 7s.
Stephen.
No, watch out for those phones. I wanted to respond to a couple of the points. What about NGOs phasing themselves out, and whether judgment of development is how many NGOs are operating in a country. There clearly is a problem with this, and I think actually one of the things I've been concerned about in terms of UK government policy in recent years, and indeed policies of other donor countries, is the shifting away again from giving budget support directly to governments and to government departments and top-ups of salaries and things like that. Because whilst there are clearly some governments that you couldn't, in all conscience, for all sorts of reasons, be giving money directly to, or be sure that it was going to be used correctly. Actually, if you don't create, that catalytic effect where citizens expect, teachers to turn up at school on time, the teachers want to be paid. They want to be a teacher, not work in an NGO. You have to create that virtuous circle, and I think we've become a bit short-sighted again in shifting back to, we must do it all through NGOs. Can't possibly deal with governments directly, and that's been quite an ideological decision that was taken by the government in the last few years. Personally, I always believed that NGOs should have as a first mission statement, I want to phase myself out in 50 years, in the global sense, and certainly in terms of individual countries have a set agenda. World Vision, when I worked for them, certainly in terms of their local development programming, they have a 15-year program in particular communities which they work through. So it is long term. They are thinking about the future. And they are thinking about exit strategy from day one. It's not always perfect, but that kind of thinking I think is absolutely crucial, rather than your kind of 1 year, 6 month rolling project program style work, which inevitably leads, I think, to carrying on. But the question the gentleman asked there about sort of British purposes and reparations and so on, look, there's quite an existential debate we can get into about the responsibilities of current generations and for past ones and everything else. Personally, I was always very attracted by the idea in climate finance that we should be paying funding for adaptation, particularly as part of global climate agreements, as compensatory finance, actually, because we have emitted all the carbon over the last X number of years, and if we're expecting people not to be able to do that, then we need to be compensating them and enabling them to develop in different ways and greener ways and skip some of those stages of dirty development. But I think you do get into a wider difficulty if you start trying to analyse which country we would owe what money to for what wrong was done in the past. I think it's much better that we focus actually on our responsibilities, not just in terms of the aid we give, but actually in our the way our corporations behave, in the way what we allow to be transacted through the City of London, whether our legal frameworks allow countries to sue each other in our courts, or vulture funds to sue countries for debts that they've picked up. I think there's some much more fundamental questions there that we can do something about today, and that we can be sure we are doing wrong, than getting into sort of that wider existential debate about which country we did the worst damage to in the days of the British Empire. But that said, I'm fully conscious of bad things this country did in its past, and one of the reasons why I believe we have a moral responsibility to provide aid to look at these issues. But it is actually in our common interest as well, going back to the point that was made right at the beginning, that there doesn't have to be this false trade-off between what's in the British interest and what's in the interests of developing countries or people. It's a false dichotomy. It's a foolish way to look at things, because actually we do have a moral responsibility, but it is in our common interest not to have countries becoming so fragile as a situation that we see in Yemen at the moment, that we see the types of corruption flourish, that we see people forced to leave their homes, and we see the tragedies in the Mediterranean that we've seen this summer. These things that should concern us, that affect us, and that's fundamentally in our own interest to deal with as well.
And finally, Fatimah, thank you, Stephen.
So I will speak to that point as well. I agree with everything you said towards the end, Stephen, particularly about the fundamental things that can be addressed in terms of how we manage our corporations and our own accountability at our end. I think changing the language from aid to reparations is a very ambitious order, but I like the way you're thinking. No, really I do, because for me, one of the issues is that not everybody knows about our colonial past. But to get to that point where there's an understanding of that obligation, we'd have to change the entire British educational system. And that needs to happen, in my view, particularly our history curriculum. Because there, if you've gone through the British education system, you can spend the entire time, especially if you don't go on to university, and even if you go on to university, having no sense whatsoever of how Britain owes its development to its colonial past. And that then continues, because much of what even happens today is still based on Britain and Europe and America continuing to develop on the back of resources coming out of developing countries that are reliant on relationships that were established as a part of that colonial past. Now, the average person doesn't know all of this. So then when we get into these huge debates about, whether we should be given aid and we have to defend the 0.7, a lot of it comes down to the perception that we're just giving something away to people who are begging off us, as opposed to a sense of actually, we're completely tied in with this issue of their lack of development. And so that seriously does need to be addressed. And I think access to information is a critical issue here as well. So again, going beyond the past and looking at the current state, it's amazing what I discover every day, despite the fact that, I work in this. So just a couple of weeks ago, I found out, and maybe it's because I don't work in Southern Africa, about the copper mines that were sold for 25 million in Zambia, and were able to recoup that within 3 months and then start making a profit. And now it's owned by non-Zambians. The fact that it was only about 5 or 6 years ago, I found out that Niger is the, fourth largest producer of uranium in the world, and yet it only contributes to less than 5% of their GDP because they own none of the mines. Dambisa Moyo is a contentious figure, but she speaks to a real sense of injustice and conflict within this whole debate, which I think many young Africans in particular are latching onto. And it's time that the British public understood some of that information.
I can testify about the British education. My 15-year-old son has just done Tudors for about the 3rd time. And World War II, obviously. That's basically what you do. Now, I don't think we have time. time for another round of questions, I'm afraid. So I would like to say thank you to an amazing panel. It's been fascinating. And thank you all very much for coming. Very, really